Um, Content or views expressed in the material showcased are those of the author or the creator and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Office of the Vice Chancellor for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, the College of Education, or other sponsors. All right, now I will introduce our speaker. Dr. Neil Lewis Jr. is a behavioral intervention scientist at Cornell University and the Weill Cornell Medicine, where he is an associate professor in the Department of Communication, the Division of Internal Medicine, and the graduate field of psychology. He also co-directs Cornell's Action Research Collaborative, which brings together researchers, practitioners, community members, and policymakers to address pressing issues in society. Dr. Lewis's research examines how people's social contexts and identities influence how they interpret and make meaning of the world around them, their motivation to pursue their goals and success and goal pursuit efforts, and the implications of these processes for interventions and policies to promote equity and social outcomes. He has received the Early Career Scholar Award from the International Communication Association in 2023, the Janet Taylor Spence Award for transformative early career contributions from the Association for Psychological Science in 2022, the Cornell Research and Extension Award for outstanding accomplishments in science and public policy in 2021, and the Sage Young Scholar Early Career Award from the Society for Personality and Social Psychology in 2020. Please welcome Dr. Neil Lewis.
Try to switch to this mic. That one should work. Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all so much for having me. Thanks to the Dean for the invitation, Allie for all of her work organizing this trip, Jared for that really nice introduction, and all of you for attending today. So I'm excited to have the opportunity to talk with you all about two topics that I've been thinking about a lot throughout my career. The issue of publicly engaged research, what does it mean to conduct that? What we get from doing that, as well as doing research for social justice. So I'm excited to have the opportunity to reflect on both of these themes today. Before I dive in, though, into the substance of the talk, I want to start off by telling you a bit more about how I got into doing this work, because I think that'll provide a useful lens for understanding the research methods and approaches that you'll see throughout the talk, as well as this publicly engaged process that I take more broadly, that I think is helpful for trying to do work that can advance equity and justice in society. So when I was a new graduate student and trying to figure out what I should study, I had a number of conversations with my advisors and mentors about that question. And one of them had a particularly good piece of advice that has stuck with me, and I'll share with you now. I know there are a number of graduate students in the room who might be thinking about this question as well. So his name was Frank Yates, who unfortunately passed away back in 2020. But Frank spent his career studying decision-making, and so seemed like a reasonable person to ask, like, how do I make this decision about what I should study? And Frank said, Frank had a particularly good piece of advice. He said that you should study the things that keep you up at night. And I thought that was a really helpful orienting way of thinking about this. So what keeps me up at night? Well, right now we live in what political scientist Jamila Michener calls a fragmented democracy. What does that mean? Michener, she spent her career studying health policies in the United States, and particularly Medicaid, which has allowed her to study how our federalist system of government and fractures in our society affects people's health outcomes. So we talk about Medicaid as if it's one thing, but people's experience with Medicaid is actually many different things depending on where you're living, how it's operationalized, and so forth. And even though she's focused on this in terms of health, I think this way of thinking about things is really useful for studying many other issues in our society. We're living in this society in which there are deeply unequal social systems that structure the opportunities that different groups of Americans have in many domains of life. So we live in a system and a society that has the state of affairs that affects how long you get to live your life and whether you have the resources to survive threats against your life, both visible threats as well as the invisible ones we've been collectively battling over the past couple of years. It affects whether you get to live in the kinds of places that are resilient and can withstand sudden and harsh changes in environmental conditions, or whether you're consigned to live in the kinds of places that get devastated over and over again when disaster strikes. It affects people's experiences with systems of government that are ostensibly set up to protect and serve us, and more generally bring about justice in our society. Some people have that kind of experience with these systems, others don't. And perhaps most relevant to this audience in the College of Ed, it affects the opportunities that we have to learn, right? So these dynamics affect whether students have access to quality education, whether they get to come to a place like Illinois and learn from leading researchers, or at a more fundamental level in K-12 schools, you learn the things that you need to learn to prepare you for everyday life. Now, the examples that I just sort of ran through, these are illustrations of a set of external forces, is how some people like to think about them. But these are forces that affect our everyday life and experiences, right? And I'm mentioning that because I think we have to contend with these issues in a deep way and deeply engage with them. If we want to do the kind of publicly engaged research that can move things forward, move us closer to achieving equity and social justice in society. And I'll show you a few examples of why I think that's the case and why I've come around to this approach in the research that I do. Let's start off by taking the example of studying racial disparities, since that's something that comes up in a lot of people's minds when they think about research around social justice, and especially in context of education. There's lots of research on racial disparities. Well, if you're going to do that research, let's say to figure out why it is that there are racial differences in student outcomes, you first have to ask yourself the question, well, what do you mean by race? Now, if you go around and ask people that, I do sometimes ask people that, they might look at you funny and be like, well, Neil, like, you know what I mean. And, I push back a little bit when that happens and say, I don't actually. Please enlighten me by what you mean. And I don't do that, to be a jerk or to be pedantic, but because when we're thinking about this question, when we're thinking about studying these issues, we could be talking about at least 12 different things, right? Are we talking about differences in skin color? Do we think that's what's going on here? Are we talking about the racial wealth gaps and how that affects outcomes? Are we talking about power relations between groups, neighborhood composition? We really have to be clear very early on as we're thinking about the research question, as we're designing the studies, as we run them, as we analyze the data and so forth. We have to be very concrete about what we mean. Otherwise, we can end up with some meaningful misunderstandings of the problems that we're working on. Or worse, we can end up coming up with solutions that aren't as effective as we might hope. And I'll walk through some to show you what I mean by that. So in recent years, a lot of social scientists have become really interested in tackling inequality in education, which, to be clear, I think is a really good thing. I like that people are excited about these questions and are working on them. But one challenge, though, that I see in this space is we're talking about very vast problems that have these multiple levels of influence. But we've often been going about these big problems, trying to address them with a category of strategies known that have come to be known as sort of these light touch intervention strategies. So, we're doing things like asking low-income students and racial minority students to get in the right mindset for schools, or, write an essay to think about your educational journey more differently. Overall, trying to quickly nudge them to do better in schools. And those kinds of strategies, I think, have their time and place. But we really have to also be mindful of their limitations, given the problems that we're trying to address. To quote Lindsay Page, we have to be cautious of the long-run benefits from some of these cheap and quick solutions, given the nature of the problems that we are wrestling with. The light touch approach, it's not going to solve these bigger problems on their own. These bigger structural problems, the chronic underinvestments in our schools and other social infrastructure, we have so many schools. This piece did a really good job of walking through some of these. These old textbooks, they're like issues in the various structure of the schools. We have to wrestle with that as we do this kind of work. These things wreak havoc on our students' experiences, and we have to deal with them in a meaningful way if we really want to help these students. Now, I'm aware of that what I've said so far is still a bit abstract. And so let me make this a bit more concrete, or as they say down south where I'm from, let me make it plain. So we live in a nation that for a long time, and still to this day, in some places, had laws on the books that geographically separated people along the color line. Right? So it was explicit government policy to segregate Americans by race and class, even in the most ostensibly progressive parts of the country. So, there are many Americans that like to think of this as just a Southern problem. But that's a huge misconception. And one of the things I really appreciate about this book by historian Richard Rothstein is it opens with a chapter on San Francisco, actually, walking through all the laws in the Bay Area that were very intentional about segregating people by race. So this is a place we like to think of as this liberal la la land. Let's look a little bit closer and see what they actually did. We have this way of thinking about these things that are somewhat misguided. Since I'm here speaking in the Midwest, I would be remiss if I didn't remind you that there are more sundown towns in the Midwest than anywhere else in the US. So for those not familiar with sundown towns, there are places where Black people were not allowed to be after dark, after these beautiful Illinois sunsets that I saw last night. And so, these are things that we have to think about. When you read the history on these things, it's very clear it's not just a Southern problem, it's a broader American phenomenon. Now, when you talk to Americans about these things these days, there's some acknowledgement that, yes, things were bad in the past. They might bring to mind, the image of Ruby Bridges and other historical moments of segregation, think, yes, things were bad in the past, but they're good now. Michael Krauss, Jennifer Richardson, and others have done lots of work on how Americans misperceive the nature of this progress. The reality, though, is that these are problems that we still live with, that we have to contend with as we do our research, as we develop policies and practices. And one of the concrete ways you can see this is by doing things like taking US Census data and mapping out where are people living in modern times. So great folks at the UVA Center for Demography have developed tools to do this. And one of the things you see when you use their tools is maps that look like this all across the United States. So this map is of southeastern Michigan. That's where I was when I began focusing on this more deeply on the University of Michigan. And you'll see in southeastern Michigan, in the southeastern quadrant of the Detroit metro area, you have predominant Black neighborhoods. There's an Asian enclave, a Hispanic enclave, but in general, people of color tend to be concentrated in that part of the city. You go up north, you cross 8 Mile Road. That's a real place, not just a movie. You move into the white suburbs. Very different experience there. You move out west towards Ann Arbor, same kind of thing. So we still have high levels of racial and economic segregation in modern life. I'm not picking on Michigan. It's not special in this regard. You see patterns like this all across the United States. The past couple of years, we've been doing a lot of work in Baltimore. Same patterns there. The configuration is a bit different because the geography is different, but the same pattern of segregation replicates. We've also recently finished up some work in Philly. Again, same kind of thing. All across the United States where you look, you see these kinds of patterns. And the broader point of sharing these maps is that although Americans like to think of these as just issues of the past, they're issues we still contend with in our modern life. So seeing these patterns all around the country has led me to ask, well, how do these forms of segregation, social stratification, pick your favorite term, that are the result of our laws and policies, how do those things affect the minds, the ways we think and feel about each other? And what do we learn from living in these different kinds of places that might affect the ways that we make decisions as individuals, as well as collectives, and especially collectives interested in social justice issues? We can start by looking at some of the concrete ways in which these social structures affect our daily lives. One of the things I've been interested in throughout my whole career is people's social networks. And by that, I'm not talking about Facebook, TikTok, or whatever Silicon Valley overlords are these days. I mean, in everyday life, who becomes friends with whom, what information do we share with each other, and what do we learn from that, and so forth. Well, when you look at American social networks, what you see is patterns that mirror the segregation I was just showing you in the maps. So there's a fascinating study from a few years ago that illustrates this phenomenon quite well. And to explain what they found, the researchers found on the study, assume for scaling purposes that the average American has 100 friends, right? Makes the math easier to think about. But when you look at the makeup of those friend groups, what you'll see is for the average white American, 91 of those friends would also be white. They'd have one Black friend. That's not a joke, that's science. One Latino friend, an Asian friend, and so forth. But you see the same thing in all the other groups, right? So for the average Black American, 83 of their friends are Black, 8 white friends, 2 Latino friends, and so on. So these places where we're living are affecting who we're meeting, who we're getting to know, but it's also affecting who's coming to mind for us as we're trying to figure out how to navigate the world and our social institutions, right? That's one of the implications we've been studying over the years. And one of the consequences of this that I started my career really focusing on was the implications of these dynamics for these education disparities that so many schools and institutions are interested in. So when I was a graduate student at Michigan, the university was very interested at that time in achievement gaps between first-generation students who were disproportionately students from ethnic minority backgrounds and low-income backgrounds, and continuing generation students who tended to be students from very advantaged families. Last night at dinner, Aisa was reminding me of the statistic at the time that we were at Michigan that the median student in Michigan was coming from a family that made $250,000 or more. So, thinking about the wealth gaps between students, these are some of the things that manifest. But, they wanted to know why they're having some gaps in student outcomes and what they might be able to do about this. And so we ended up spending some time really trying to understand how these various social forces affected students' experiences and what that might mean for intervention. So we spend time not only talking to students about their experiences, but also partnering with the kind of institutional actors that could help us understand more of what was going on. So we did things like work with the registrar to analyze student level data to figure out like where are the bottlenecks here in students' journey. We were able to find out things like, well, where are the high schools that students are coming from? And then going out to those places to learn more about what's actually going on in those schools that might be affecting students' experiences and so on. So we go out in the world to those places, learn more about the context on the ground and what that might mean for students' experiences. Well, by doing that, we're able to learn more about how these longstanding patterns of neighborhood segregation, resource differences, social network differences, and these dynamics that come from really living in an unequal society, how are those things affecting students? It became very clear that if you grow up in a school that is in a district that is constantly deprived of resources, you have a very different educational experience and journey than if you grow up in a school that has lots of resources and advantages. And to put a finer point on exactly what I mean, in the state of Michigan, one of the things that was happening was that the state actually passed relatively modern laws that was effectively lowering the quality of education in some school districts than for others, specifically in minority serving school districts. So for instance, they passed this law that made it such that the Troy Public School System became the only district where teachers were not required to meet the same level of certification, right? So the district that predominantly students of color and lower income students, they literally were not providing the same level of educational resources as students elsewhere in the state. So this stuff matters when you think about students' experiences and what you might want to do to improve them. Depending on where you happen to be born and raised, you got one of two different kinds of educational experiences in your first 18 years of life. Let's suppose then that both sets of students move across the state to Ann Arbor to start college. You have one set of students who's had classes that are not that different than what we teach first year students when they're out on campus. And you have another set of students who've had experiences nowhere close to that. That is going to create some of the issues that the university is now interested in addressing, right? Those differences matter for the way that students end up thinking about school and what they end up doing when they get there. So you have one set of students who've had classes not that different, other set who's had classes nowhere close to that. Now, let's say you have these students sitting in the same calculus class. You'll see why I pick on calculus in a moment. This experience creates a somewhat anxiety-inducing educational experience for students. In addition to trying to learn the material, they're also looking around to see how other students are doing. Like, this is just what students do. They use peers as standards of comparison. And if you're sitting there in class, everyone else seems to know what's going on. They're keeping up with the professor. And you're struggling, that can undermine the sense of belonging, right? So, at least the psychologists who are working the space, this is one of the constructs that they're very interested in. How can we raise sense of belonging? Well, why don't students feel like they belong in the first place? Like, we really have to wrestle with some of those issues. Success might start to seem unlikely for people, like if you're noticing these broader patterns. And this can undermine the motivation to persist, right? And so these thoughts and feelings that students have, they're not coming out of nowhere, right? And so the idea of just trying to tackle this by trying to just change the way that students think, like, that is missing part of what's going on, right? The reality is that, in effect, by segregating our societies in the ways that we have, the law has really created two different educational pathways. And we have to wrestle with that. There are some students for whom there's basically a clear shot from the cradle to college, and there are other students for whom we've made it a long and winding road. And that's something we have to deal with as we try to address these issues. These broader patterns of inequality matters for the kinds of interventions that we have to come up with to try and address these issues. We can't just give students a brief intervention and expect it to solve those problems. That's something I think is important for us to take into account as we think about these issues. In this country, we love quotes like this, MLK's, the arc of the moral universe. It's long, it bends towards justice. But we have to remember that it's not going to bend on its own. Like, we actually have to do the work to figure out what it takes to bend it, and be willing to do the hard work to bring about equity and justice. There are times that the light touch stuff has its place, but there are other times that we need to take a heavier hand to make more wholesale systemic changes to move the needle on these outcomes. So with that in mind, one of the things we decided to do at that time, and I've done some follow-up work since then, is really take these issues quite seriously and use that to build a program within the institution to try and address these issues. And I'll tell you about what we did in that program. So when I was at Michigan, this was work with Frank before he passed away. We built this program that was called the Preparation Initiative. And the program was built with all of these things in mind, considering all of these structural and experience differences. It was designed to try to address all of those. This, to be clear, it was therefore not a brief intervention. It was and continues to be a more heavy-handed, holistic intervention built into the structure of the university. It's housed within the business school, in part because at the time they had a dean that really wanted to try something bold, and so it was housed there. But we did a few different things in that context. One of the things we did was we had an orientation freshman year. So students' first weekend on campus, we have an orientation for them that was really about socializing students for success in college. So there are lots of things you need to know to be a successful college student that no one will ever teach you, right? You show up on campus, your professors will teach you the content of their class. No one's teaching you what are these office hours that you see on the syllabus? No one's teaching you where to go to get support if you're struggling and the like. You're supposed to figure it out on your own. Now, if you have family members that went to college, you have someone you can call and text and figure what all this is. If you don't, you're sort of left to figure to struggle on your own, and that's a really hard thing. So we try to address that with an orientation student's first weekend on campus. One of the things we learned from our work with the registrar data was figuring out what are the bottleneck courses in the curriculum. So where are the students really struggling, and provided then academic coaches to work with students in those bottleneck courses. So the reason I mentioned calculus earlier, calculus was one of those tough courses, econ another one. And so we could provide more holistic support in those areas. We had these writing assignments that we had our students doing that was really connecting, giving them this opportunity to reflect on and connect their coursework with their future goals. So students get very frustrated and demoralized when they're sitting in class and they're like, I have no idea when I will use this in my life. Understandable, but having an opportunity to sort of reflect on that and think about how they might connect what they're learning with these goals that they'd like to achieve was another thing we did in this program. And the reality of college, of course, is it will get hard at some point. Everyone struggles in this. And so we had academic advisors and peer mentors who had been down this road before that you can talk to when you're struggling. And that was then helpful for students to have someone to sort of lean on when things got really difficult. So we did this work, and then there's obviously the question, well, does it do anything? And there we did an evaluation to evaluate the impact of this program. So after a couple of years, we were able to look and take a matching strategy that allows us to estimate the effects of participation compared to equally matched students at the university. And we were able to do this again because of the partnership with registrar, which allowed us to pull in all this data to find truly matched sample to compare to. And when we looked at what happened, there are a few things that stood out. One, looking at students' grades, especially in these bottleneck courses, this program had pretty sizable effects on students' performance. So they're doing much better in Econ 101 and calculus, and even in freshman writing. So these courses that were really big bottlenecks before, where students were struggling and having difficulty moving forward, they were now doing much better in these courses. And then the bigger effect for me was, the more meaningful effect for me was the effect on graduation rates. Right, so these were the students who were most likely to drop out of the university. Now we're finishing, much more likely to finish, which you think about has implications not just for them, but their families and future generations and so forth. So by building sort of an institutional intervention, we're able to produce this impactful outcome. And since I've been at Cornell, Cornell's now doing a version of this in my college, focused more on life science students where we have similar issues. Hopefully that paper will be out soon. So how do you know, though, what needs to go into a program or intervention like this to make it effective? Well, there are a couple of methods that we can use. One of them that I think gets overlooked a lot in the social sciences these days is the method of, well, talking to people. We didn't learn all of these issues just by computing statistics. Statistics were important, like there's some things that we could analyze within the larger institutional data. But the methodological approach that I think was most helpful for figuring out like what to do that we've been shying away from, unfortunately, in social sciences lately, is really going out and, again, talking to people in all these other contexts to really get a sense of what's going on and therefore what issues need to be addressed. Doing the kind of work that can advance social justice more broadly, I think sometimes requires using more qualitative methods to dig deep and understand what are people thinking, what are they experiencing. For whatever reason, there's been some disparagement of these methods lately, but I think that's a problem for our field, right? That it hinders our ability to truly address education inequality, and inequality in many other domains. That there are lots of things we can gain from these approaches that will generate far more actionable insights than we could ever get from a highly controlled randomized control trial. Like I think RCTs are important, but they don't teach us everything, and we need to create more room for multiple methods. And this is something that's become clear to me, not just in the education realm, but in some of the research I do in other domains as well that I'll tell you about. So, what I've shared so far is sort of where I started. I started studying inequality in education, ways to address it. But as my career has progressed, I've started working on a number of other related issues, including issues in the environment and how they connect to education and other outcomes. But doing that other work, like these same approaches were helpful as well. It's really necessary to take these same kinds of approaches when doing work to try to bring about equity and justice in these other domains. So in the environmental realm, there are many injustices that, once again, affect a variety of outcomes. For instance, due to the history of environmental racism, racial minorities and lower income people are often consigned to live in or near what environmental sociologist Ursula Taylor calls toxic communities. So they're the ones who have to live closer to environmental hazards, the ones who have the highways get put through their neighborhoods and so forth. And so this really creates a number of issues. Well, because of these consequences, low income and racial minority people are quite concerned about these issues. So collaborators, Adam Pearson, John Scholt, and others have documented this issue quite well. And I'll show just one of the studies out of this path that's shows sort of the mismatch between how we think about these issues and what's really going on. So if you ask Americans how concerned each of these groups are about environmental issues, this is what they'll say. They think that young people, women, and white people are really concerned, but racial minorities and low-income people not as much. If you actually sample all these groups, you find reality runs counter to these perceptions, that the highest levels of environmental concern in the US are consistently among racial minorities and lower income Americans. This makes sense given what we know about, again, ecological systems. If you are having to face many of these challenges, they're very salient and concerning to you. But at the same time, if you don't have to face these things yourself, but you don't know anyone who does because they're not in social networks, you wouldn't know that they're concerned. So this is part of what's going on. Another part of what's going on is that the media doesn't really help. So the media is also stratified in its own way, which affects coverage of these issues. And one of the things researchers have found in this space is that media is less likely to cover issues around inequality and injustice, in part because they're concerned about offending some audiences. I'm actually going to speed through this because there's one of the studies about that issue that the media has this imagined audience in mind that they're writing these stories for, and so producers are less likely to write about the inequality and justice for not offending, for fear of offending those audiences. There's a particularly egregious case of this a couple of years ago where the Associated Press was writing a story about environmental injustice and focused on environmental activists. This is the group of environmental activists that they were focused on. This is the photo they published. They cropped the one Black woman out of the story. Thankfully, Greta spoke up and was like, this is messed up. And so they end up correcting it. But the broader point is we're having these forces that are like limiting what we learn about these issues and how to address them. So why am I talking about this? I'm talking about it because it has really big implications for our ability to collectively come together to bring about social justice. So one of the things we've been studying both in the past and in some of our ongoing research is just how these forces that lead us to misperceive one another end up affecting our willingness to work together to address these issues. So, not learning about people's concerns, not understanding that there's actually shared concerns that we can work together on, it actually undermines abilities to build broader coalitions to address these issues. But that's something that I think we as scientists have to think about. Like what is our role in making it clear where people stand and making it clear that there are actually opportunities to collaborate and address some of these issues. That's one of the other things we've been thinking about in our work and what we've been trying to be mindful of in our lab, because the science that we produce that directly feeds into these perceptions and our willingness to work together. So this is one of the reasons that one of the things we've done a lot over the years is put a lot of effort into recruiting members from communities that have historically been ignored and excluded in these discussions, and studying their perspectives and documenting their perspectives in the scientific record, right? So we've done a number of studies that are in partnership with community organizations, with policy organizations and the like, to be able to do that, to diversify the samples of people that we study. And this truck that you're seeing here is an instrumental sort of tool in this process, because one of the issues is, our campus is in Ithaca, not the easiest place to get to. Somewhat like Champaign, but so not everyone, can get to our campus to participate in studies on campus. So we have this mobile research lab that allows us to take the research out into the world, creating greater opportunities for people to participate. And so that matters for what we learn and what we can do with that knowledge. As we've been diversifying our samples in these ways, we've learned that actually we might need to measure some things in different ways than is traditionally studied in the literature. So, for example, in one of our studies, or one of our sets of studies, we've been asking these questions about what are the most important environmental issues. And we did this study in San Antonio. And, there's some answers that you get that are similar to what your college student samples will give you. They'll say air pollution is important, green space is important, and so on. But we've also been hearing about issues of racism, poverty. These are important environmental issues that need to be addressed. Doesn't come up much in our college student samples. And that's something that I think is important for scientists to wrestle with. By doing those first studies and carrying that, we ended up doing much larger national surveys and finding that actually these are patterns that generalize much more, but we as researchers wouldn't have known that because we didn't take the time to begin with to dig deep and figure out what else we should be studying. So that's something that's expanded some of the ways that we've been studying these issues. But again, it's because we've been mixing these methods, right? It's not just the survey data. In fact, the original survey data wasn't necessarily telling us that. It's the qualitative work that we were doing that informed what we needed to be asking in future surveys. And so there's a back and forth here that I think is important to keep in mind. So, we can have to take a step back then and think about, like, why does this matter? Like, why go through the effort of doing this? I realize that what I'm saying sounds time consuming. We had some good conversation this morning about the amount of time required to do some of this. Like, why would you do this to yourself? I think there are a few reasons that we can and should think about beyond just the publication. One of the papers that I've been reading over the past couple of years that's really helped me sort of concretely think about the importance of this is this paper by Cameron Brigg and colleagues, which comes out of the environmental psych tradition. So Cameron studies environmental issues, and one of the things he and colleagues have noted in this paper is that we sometimes forget that our analyses that suggest taking a particular action will create problems for other groups because we don't study those other groups. And that's something that we as researchers need to think about as we're doing our research. And there's an example that they highlighted in this paper that I think is helpful for making this concrete. And it's an example of this policy in the UK to get rid of diesel and gasoline cars by 2040. So the goal of this policy is to reduce health and environmental risks associated with air pollution. And so this policy seems quite good for people in the UK. What we don't usually talk about with this policy, though, is that it drives up demand for lithium-ion batteries containing cobalt. A lot of that's mined in the Congo, often by children. And so the policy will surely save European lives, but estimates from the United Nations and elsewhere suggest that it will actually vastly increase risks to and environmental damage to people in the Congo. This, by the way, is one of our big challenges in the United States with the broader electrification movement that we're going through. There's a recent report noting that the US and Western Europe alone has driven a 20-fold increase in demand for the raw materials to produce all the electric stuff that we want to buy. And that's leading to exploitation of people in poorer countries to get these materials. So in our society, we just talk about the benefits. We don't really talk about the costs of these things that we want. But that creates a broader problem for our society. It's part of what increases divisions between people. When you only think about your benefits, but not how they might cost others, we don't act in ways to make those benefits more mutual. And because of that, instead of bringing people together for collective action, what we end up doing is breeding resentment between groups. We see that at the global scale, but we also see it in even smaller microcosms. In New York, where I live, we've been seeing this play out at a very local scale. So our version of this problem is there's demand for putting together these solar farms to help our transition to renewable energies, which again, sounds great, but you need a lot of land to do that. The place in New York that has a lot of land is upstate New York in the rural areas. And so that's where the solar farms are being built, or there's proposals to build them. But there's actually been a lot of opposition to them from people upstate. And, there were some stereotypes that, well, this is because the rural folks are like conservative or they don't believe in climate change and blah, blah, blah. And so some researchers did some work on this and found, actually, no, that's not the problem. They like the idea of the solar farms, but it's the lack of local benefits that's driving the opposition, that these farms are being seen as we're having to take our land to get these solar farms up, and they're sending the energy downstate to the people in New York City. Like, why should we sacrifice our land? We're not getting any benefits from it. And I think these are things we have to think about as we're doing research, as we're producing these kinds of outcomes. How are we engaging the various publics that will be affected by what we do? These kinds of things happen all the time. Right. Our policies, our practices often have disparate impacts, but we're often not studying or otherwise engaging with the people who are most adversely affected by them. And I think that's something that we have to think about more. It's something that weighs on me as we do our work. So we do our work in the ways that we do for really two core reasons. One, from a purely scientific perspective. We don't know how well a lot of the models that we've been developing hold up beyond the traditional samples that we study. So in its own right, it's worthwhile to do this. But second, from an ethical perspective, if scientific knowledge will continue to lay the foundation for the policies we set in our society, for the practices we develop, which I think it should, then I think that knowledge ought to include the broader base of people that will be affected by it. Right. And that second point is something that has come up a lot. Participants have thanked us for bringing the lab and creating opportunities to participate, which at first was weird. When you do studies with undergrads, the end of the study is usually like, when will my extra credit be on SONA? Not like, thanks for the opportunity to participate, but it's become clear over time why this matters more to our participants. Some of them have said to us, no one usually cares what we think. And that's something that is sad to me, but makes sense given how we typically operate. It's as if many people have learned from us, the research community, that a lesson that was crystallized for me in an op-ed writing workshop actually a few years ago, which is that there's some people who narrate the world and other people who have their world narrated for them. That there's some people who get to have their perspectives be part of the scientific record, and there are others who don't, and they're always in that latter category. And that matters in a number of ways, right? Their exclusion from the research process has downstream consequences for what society does with this research. As Aaron Squire noted, historical exclusivity often has a way of turning into present and institutionalized tragedy. So whose story gets told matters, who gets to be part of our studies matters, who we engage in the research process matters. So these are some of the reasons that I've been doing research in these publicly engaged ways. The way that I think about all of this now is that when we make these decisions about who we're including and engaging in our studies, we are implicitly making decisions about who matters to us. And that's something we have to think about. We have to remember that because these decisions that we make have important implications for the knowledge that we create and for the policies and practices that are developed from that knowledge. And so that's something I want us to all keep in mind. Doing this work, though, requires strong teams and tremendous support. The work itself is a collective and engaging enterprise. And so in closing, I just want to thank the remarkable team of students, collaborators, community partners who contributed to the work that I present today and who've really shaped my thinking around these issues over the years. And also, of course, want to thank the funders who have supported this work. And thank you all again for inviting me and attending today.
All right, thank you, Dr. Lewis, for that very informative, inspirational, and riveting talk. At this point, we will take questions. And if you have a question, please raise your hand and I'll bring the mic to you just so that we can include our online audience. Who has a question?
Thank you for coming. One other question with all of this, pardon me. One other part of the equation, to me, it seems, is the involvement of the parents. Again, as an educator myself in primary and secondary, what has happened is the parents have had more control over the classroom than the actual educators. So what you now have is you have parents deciding if children are going to matriculate to the next grade, not on the skills that they have, but just on their say-so. And what that has created is now in a lot of areas, we're getting students who are going all the way up till their 9th, 10th, 11th, even 12th grade, and they're functionally illiterate and they don't have any basic skills. So how do we fix that also?
No, great question. So one of the things I think, and before I don't have the answer to this, one of the things I wonder about is why would what is different now, right? That is making parents feel like they need to do this, right? That they, even though their kids might not be ready, like they want to push them forward. That's something like we need to interrogate as a society, right? That presumably they are concerned that their kids are going to be left behind somehow, right? That whether they're not going to get jobs or what have you. So I think these are some of the things that, like, as a concrete step, I would want to do some either interviews or focus groups with some parents that we know are like sort of pushing for the kids to move forward anyway, like get a sense of what's going on and what are their concerns. And if we are able to address some of those concerns, would they still have those approaches or not? And I'll bring an example from the program I mentioned we did in Michigan. One of the things that came up sometimes is the possibility of staying an extra year, right? Which there was resistance to that too. Like, well, I want to get out in 4 years too. And we had to have some conversations with students that like sometimes it's better to take a little extra time now and that be better prepared for the long run, right? But part of being able to have those conversations was knowing and being able to tell them about the fact that actually there are university policies that allow you to get additional financial aid if you need it, right? Because the reason there's wanting to rush through is they're worried about the money, And that's a real thing to be worried about. And so if you're not able to address that in a conversation, then it's harder to. So I would want to know more from these parents, what are these concerns driving them to push on anyway, and see if we can try and address some of this. There's a question here. Yeah, sorry.
Thank you very much for this insightful presentation. Just to the question in the back, just want to offer another perspective. I do wonder if the trust in K-12 education and, you know, the professionalization of teachers might also have something to do with that. In other words, are parents trusting, you know, that teachers are really having the best interest of, you know, students. But the question I want to have is, I wonder if you can share a little bit more about the Michigan intervention. I know there's a lot of those types of programs, you know, nationwide that try to address this disparities in terms of readiness. We have one here in Illinois. It started in the summer. In my previous institution, there was a NAVIC program. So what is unique in other ways? Or maybe we can say a little bit more about the elements of the program and the ones you felt may have been a little more instrumental in the success that you've had.
Yeah, so one thing I think is different is the length of the program and the continued engagement. So like we had a different program at Cornell too, that I think Michigan has one of these too, that it's like you start in the summer, like and they do some stuff in the summer, then semester starts and you're on your own. And I think those you know summer start programs can be helpful, but like having continued support when you're really in the thick of it in the semester. That stuff really helps. So in this program, you know, students are getting together. They have their classes, but they're getting together every week as well with their peer mentors. You know, we had this like one credit class too, that's sort of this professional development kind of class, but you're getting together every week, learning these different skills, but you have your community there with you, and that I think. That's a really big thing. Even when we talk with our students at the end, you know, being in this otherwise, you know, probably white institution with this like legacy around it that's like hard to navigate on your own. Like we having this community that you're going through the whole time, like that helps. In addition to the like all the stuff that we do. So I think that repeated sense of support going throughout is really at the heart of what's going on. Whereas the ones that you come for 2 weeks and then you're on your own, like the 2 weeks were great, but then after that, like what do you do when like you're really like into this semester?
I have a one question. Oh, okay. How does the No Child Left Behind Act impact your work and the future ability to change?
How does No Child Left Behind affect the work and what?
And the future ability to change?
I'm gonna have to think about that one for a while. Like there's so much going on in the space because of that change, but also like more local level legislation that it's hard to give a broader answer to that question. I mean, that's a theme, and I'm sure you all discuss a lot in colleges about is the interaction between what the federal government says, but really local jurisdictions having lots of control. So it's hard for me to give a generalization, but I'm going to keep thinking about that question from like.
One other question to go along with what I mentioned earlier was the last time that we were really successful academically at a primary, secondary level was without a lot of the technology. Whereas like you're getting a lot of rote memory, you're getting a lot of the basic structures in. So why is it that we continue to push in towards technology, even though I know it is a part of our society? if it's not actually benefiting the students that they're supposed to be benefiting.
Yeah. Yeah, so there are a couple of things that part of the reason I like to think about these things in the broader system is what's going on in all these offices. So yes, there's lots of tech involved in teaching and learning now. Some of that is preparation for work, it can be technologies work. Some of that is also we have teacher shortages that we think, I think sometimes incorrectly, that technology will help solve some of those problems. But there's you know, tech gets pushed in for multiple reasons. And it does raise, I think, a lot of questions about when is it going to help, when is it going to emerge, and those questions are, the answers to those questions are, I think, more complex than we often realize, and even as administrators making decisions, I realize. And I'll use an example from, we've done some work in the online learning space, like massive open online courses, because there's a movement behind that. Well, that works well for some students, and it doesn't for a lot of students. And that heterogeneity is something we actually have to really wrestle with. Like, which students are we actually helping when we do that? And which students are we gonna actually make things worse and leave them behind? We have to be very honest about that. But if you're gonna invest, I understand that at the same time, if you're gonna invest in building those kinds of systems, it takes a lot of money to build those kinds of systems. You just want to push as many people through it. So I think that's why we really have to be very mindful about the broader, even economic forces behind some of these decisions, because those are not always aligned with the educational one. And we should be honest about that.
We may have time for one quick question.
Thank you. I just want to comment on the issue of inclusion and exclusion and how technology can be a barrier to access. I come from the University of Pretoria in South Africa, and we have a challenge of inequalities and also the issue of access, especially for Black students. And some years ago, 10 years ago, we introduced the online application system, and it was excluding the majority of poor Black students. But as a faculty, we decided that we will go and recruit and give them manual forms to complete and bring them on campus to be uploaded on the system. And we found that to be a very powerful means of providing access to potentially good students who would otherwise have not been able to gain access to higher education. So my comment, I think, is that we need to find innovative ways of granting access. Otherwise, if at all we hide behind technology, we are going high-tech, we are destroying lives and excluding people who potentially could have benefited from higher education. And the kind of students we targeted were unemployed young people who were not in education but had passed what we refer to as matric. They had passed K-12, but they did not have the means, like money, to go to education, did not have access to technology to make them apply, did not have role models in their communities to assist them. But we got in the first cohort around 2018. In 2022, the first cohort graduated with 80% success rate. So I think that if we are committed to the course, we need to find ways of navigating around some of these barriers.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I think the creating these platforms and there's the opportunity for graduate access, and you can get to these better outcomes, but assuming that that will happen doesn't mean it will happen. And so, yeah, I absolutely agree that we need to be looking at what is actually happening, evaluating the effects of what's happening, and figure out, when is this going to work and when it's not. So there are definitely success stories there, but there are also lots of failure stories, and we need to really study what are the conditions that are leading to one kind of outcome for another, and not assume the one side will fit all.
All right, everyone, join me again in thanking Dr. Lewis for his great talk.